Hi, everyone. Welcome to a special episode of the Wine Pair Podcast where I give Carmela a little break and then I get the chance to interview people who are actually involved in making wine. This week, I'm talking to Karl Weichold, the estate winemaker at Stoller Wines in Oregon. And we have a great conversation about his start in winemaking in Texas, how he ended up in Oregon, and how his approach to winemaking has changed over the years. It's a really fascinating interview and you're going to love it. Hello, and welcome to the Wine Pair Podcast. I'm Joe, your sommelier of a reasonably priced wine, and for this special episode, I am on my own as my wine pairing partner in crime is busy making cakes for her Baby Cakes micro bakery, which, by the way, you can learn more about if you head over to her website, lovebabycakes.com. Anyway, now, as a quick orientation to our podcast, what we usually do in each episode is learn about, taste, and review 3 wines that are reasonably priced, which means under $20, and should be easy to find. However, for this special set of episodes, we interview people who are actually involved in making wine. Sometimes, like today, those wines don't necessarily fall into the reasonably priced range, or at least some of their wines don't fall into the reasonably priced range, but that's okay, because part of what we want to do with our podcast is to educate ourselves and you on different aspects of wine knowledge in a fun, entertaining, and unstuffy way, and even a fun and entertaining way, as Decanter Magazine has called our podcast. And that's what we're doing today. A small plug before we get into the interview with Karl from Stoller Family Wines. If you like what you're hearing or are interested in hearing our other regular episodes, please subscribe to our podcast so you can hear more, especially since you're only getting one half of the Wine Pair Podcast in this episode. And you can go to our website at thewinepairpodcast.com to send us a note or subscribe to our newsletter. And you can follow us on Instagram at the Wine Pair Podcast. And if you like what you're hearing, leave us a nice rating and review. But without further ado, let's get to our interview with Karl. Hello, Karl, and welcome to the Wine Pair Podcast. It's by the way, it's just me today, Karl. It's just one half of the Wine Pair, so you'll have to suffer through just with me.
No worries. Yeah, thanks for having me on the podcast.
Oh yeah, super excited. And for all of our friends out there in listening land, we have a really special treat today. We're joined all the way from the great state of Oregon, which is just our neighbor to the south, because we're in Seattle, is Karl Weichold, who's the estate winemaker at Stoller Wines. And you've also done stints previously at places like Erath and wineries in Texas. And yes, I guess there are wineries in Texas. So looking forward to learning more about that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm just glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me on.
You bet. Well, I'm excited to jump in and learn more about how you approach winemaking and all that fun stuff. But maybe we'll just start out by you telling us a little bit about you, like your background, where you're from, your family, and then we can talk about how you got into winemaking and the other good stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was born, raised, and then went to college in College Station, Texas. I was the son of a professor there at the college. So when it came time to kind of pick where I was going to go to school, I got a little bit of a benefit going to the same place Dad worked, for sure. Mm-hmm. The things that, interested me kind of coming out of high school were mostly chemistry, biology, the life sciences generally. I wasn't much in the way of a musician or an artist or anything like that, even though I tried my hand at trombone and stuff like that. I still felt like the gravitational pull of life sciences was to me intoxicating enough to kind of get me out of trying anything in terms of the creative components of schooling. So I went to school at Texas A&M for biochemistry and genetics, honestly, because I had a thirst for just kind of understanding the intricacies of how life worked. And I think in terms of just a holistic education in how the chemistry blends with the function of life. There's no better way to kind of understand it than those two majors right there. But at the end of it, I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I was in academia doing lab work for not only most of my college career, but then before that, like even when I was in high school. And I was kind of wondering, like, well, I've got a couple different paths to choose. I can go into med school, but blood made me squeamish. So that was probably not going to be an option. Academia started to get a little dry, if I'm being honest. I, kind of enjoyed, some of the people I was working with outside of academia later in restaurants and things like that. And then finally, just pharmaceutical sales, which was, it kind of seemed where a lot of people in those majors were going. So anyways, I was kind of wondering where I was going to end up after that. And as I was working in a restaurant, actually an Italian restaurant in college, I started to fall in love with wine quite a bit. Managed their wine program for a little bit, and didn't really think about making a career out of it per se. I was just intrigued by the beverage, and thought that it was a neat little departure from what I was doing. And after about 6 months of just not really, having any direction there for a second, a buddy of mine that I worked with at that restaurant invited me out to work a weekend with him in the Texas Hill Country. And we were going out to a winery to do a little bit of wine work, a little bit of planting on some new acreage that they had. And then just general work around the sales floor and the winery itself. And I mean, in one weekend, I was running pumps, I was planting grapes, I was doing stoichiometry, I was interacting with people, and I just thought, my God, I can't walk away from this. And at the time, I had a offer from Merck Pharmaceutical to go work as a sales rep for them, and basically tore up that offer. I begged the guy that I worked a weekend with out there for a job for about half the pay. Really pissed my parents off, and then ended up working in wine in the Texas Hill Country for the next 2.5 years. And since then, I just really haven't looked back. Moved out to Oregon in 2009 after that stint in Texas for a position out at a place called 12th and Maple, where I ran their lab for several years until ERATH tapped me for a position as their assistant winemaker. And then when Stoller reached out to me in 2020 about a position for their the state winery as the winemaker there, I basically couldn't say no. So anyways, that's me. That's why I'm here.
That's fascinating. I have so many questions to ask you. I mean, so really, when you left your degree, wine wasn't even on it wasn't like, so there's nothing in your undergrad background that you're like, oh, I'm interested in the chemistry of wine or anything like that. That never even came up.
Honestly, the background itself made the understanding of enology very easy for me to just kind of sprint through later in my career. Mm-hmm. The biochemistry there, I think, is a great foundation for effectively all the parts that I think that a lot of people that go into wine with different backgrounds end up getting hung up on. And to me, it was stuff that I'd already learned in 200 level biology or physical chemistry or something like that. And it wasn't necessarily that I needed to be good at that. I was just familiar with it. And I think that that familiarity was able to get me through kind of the more rigorous parts of the wall of academic text that I had to end up getting through to understand the nuts and bolts about how wine's made.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, we'll talk. I do want to get back to sort of this art versus science of wine, but maybe also just curious, because Italian wine is kind of how I got into wine. Mm-hmm. So when you were working at the restaurant, was there any specific wine or anything that made you go, I kind of like this stuff?
Yes, actually, I actually just got back from Barolo and Barbaresco 2 weeks ago. And,
okay. It's on.
No, we probably got plenty to talk about there, but no, it was literally a 10-year-old Barolo from Pio Cesare, and it was the wine that like put me over the edge in terms of just like, my God, this is a beverage I need to know more about. I'm so sorry, I can't remember the actual vintage.
But shame on you. No, totally
I know. I mean, I was 21 at the time, but like, it was one of these wines that just, it was haunting. It had this, a depth of character, this almost incessant need for contemplation, like in the glass. It was something that changed basically how I looked at beverages from that point forward. I don't know. I know this is like all kind of like stilted language, but at the same time, I mean, I think anybody that's had that experience with wine or maybe whiskey or any beverage you kind of need to sit and sip with, like that's kind of real, right? Like that's just how I think you react to that moment in time. And yeah, from there, I just explored the rest of Italian wines and worked my way into French eventually. And honestly, from there, I think I gained an appreciation for Burgundy wines, which eventually led me domestically to Oregon wines. That's why I think I'm making Pinot Noir now.
Well, I mean, it's kind of actually, this is not about me, this is about you, but I had very similar experience where my father-in-law is very, very much about Italian wines, and he sort of got me started on wines. But since then, I have moved more towards Pinots. And so anyway, we're like, there's so much we're going to talk about, Karl. I'm so excited. One more thing I wanted to ask you about your background, and that is, I made a little joke about it, but honestly, I don't think until pretty recently I even knew that there were really wines being made, wine grapes being grown and wines being produced in Texas. Tell us a little bit more about the Texas wine industry. I know that's not what we're going to focus on, but I am just curious about it. Maybe the stage that it was at when you started getting involved and how that influenced you.
Oh, I'd love to give a shout out to a couple different places down there that got me started in the industry, but they're honestly not just making that industry work, but excelling at it. At the time when I was developing that part of my career in the cellar, Texas wine was still kind of struggling to get on its feet in terms of identity and research dollars. But in the last 10 years, maybe the last 15 years, it has made leaps and bounds from where it was. The integration between research institutions, namely Texas Tech and Texas A&M, and the private firms that are making wine has been outstanding. Producers are bringing in top flight talent that I think are finally going to be able to craft the form that becomes the identity of what Texas wine can be. People that I'd recommend are places like Uplift and William Chris out of the Fredericksburg area. They're doing serious wines in a place that previously is just kind of known for tourism. I think at this point, you're not only going to be out there just for the beauty of the landscape. Now you're going to be heading out there for some very serious undertakings in terms of what Texas wine can be.
So in terms of your background, did anybody, maybe it was in one of these Texas wineries, probably was, or maybe it was when you got to Oregon, but was there a mentor? Was there somebody who really kind of showed you the ropes?
Yeah, honestly, one of the biggest people in my career that has informed me of my winemaking style has been Gary Horner at Erath. Gary Horner had worked in this industry for at least 3 decades at this point, and the pioneer of numerous novel technologies for this region that I think are not only going to delimit us from kind of growing as a region, but also probably define us as well. And him being able to make that quality wine on that scale and then learn from him personally has been invaluable to me in my career. He's kind of a luminary in this industry, and honestly, I owe a lot to him and his experience in terms of my own winemaking style and just decisions based on that. I don't think we ever saw eye to eye on every single thing, but in the end, everybody's their own winemaker. Even still, I think at all of them that I've worked with, this guy had a logical case for effectively every decision that he ever made, and that's kind of what I took into my own winemaking.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your winemaking style. So, are there things that you think, whether from him or your background at the Italian restaurant or, whatever, that really sort of defines what you think of or how you think of making wine, and any sort of signature wines that you make that you think help define you?
Yeah, I think everybody's, from Oregon's going to tell you this, but that, they try to get out of the way of the grapes and not put too much influence on the winemaking side of the grapes. But I think to do that on the scale that we're making wine here, rather across numerous different scales that we're making wine here at Stoller, that challenge becomes a little harder to do dogmatically. And I think that at some point you do have to become adaptive to not only the scale of winemaking, but then also the vintage conditions and basically the logistics that you may have as a winery in order to accomplish those goals. So how would that define me as a winemaker? Honestly, it's, attempting to be as, I don't know, intellectually honest about my winemaking philosophy as possible, not only in the esoteric sense, but then also in how the practical application of that theory goes into the winemaking. So ideally, I don't take too much risk in terms of native fermentations or novel modes of like growing grapes or anything like that. I really like kind of pretty straightforward attempts to make wine that are consistent from site to site and vintage to vintage, unless I do have to change them for kind of the sake of adaptation. So that's not to say that my wines are entirely technical. That certainly they can change, kind of based on the challenges that we're facing on a vintage to vintage basis. But at the same time, I still would consider myself a little bit more of a technical winemaker than a philosophical one, for sure.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's one of the questions is, are you more on the art or the science side? And I have to say, with the chemistry background, biochemistry background, I'm inclined to think that maybe it's more science than art, but I'm not sure. And then I was thinking too, because Stoller makes a variety of labels. One of them is called chemistry, and I was starting to put it together now. Mm-hmm. Like maybe that's Karl at play. But tell us a little bit more about where you kind of land on that art versus science aspect of winemaking.
Man, this is a can of worms. I think that first of all, I think that you can look at science as a means to do your art. I know that's potentially a way of dodging that paradigm right there, but at the same time, I think that biochemistry kind of showed me that if you have an understanding of kind of the basic function of a pretty complex system, you can change things in that complex system that basically allow you to then show your art in a mode of winemaking that could be something like a creative purchase in that. I think the whole paradigm of art versus science needs to include a third axis to one of logistics. In that, like, if you do trend more towards the art side or the science side, that's great in terms of forming a philosophy unto itself. But the actual execution of that vision is crucial in that. I think any winemaker will tell you that their success is based on a number of very small decisions and the execution of those decisions over time. And that if you're not a good logistician in terms of executing those, then your dream's probably not being realized to its fullest extent. So yeah, I probably fall somewhere on the side that emphasizes a lot more logistics than anything else, because ultimately, depending on how I adapt to any vintage or style choice I need to meet, I need to make sure that whatever my clear-eyed vision of that winemaking style might be is actually executed to those ends. I
have a question that just kind of popped in my head just based on what you're talking about. And I don't know if you're going to feel like it's related or not. But often, I think that a lot of times people forget that wine is produce. It's a living thing, or the grapes that it comes from at least are living things. So I'm just curious, do you spend more time with the grapes or with the juice, or is it both?
Yeah, I think that in the past, I've spent more time with the juice, but since I've got to work with a little bit more in terms of the grapes here at Stoller, my focus has been primarily getting the grapes correct and then being a little bit more dogmatic about it in the winery. I felt that in previous positions, I had just seen fruit and then reacted to it. And that's not necessarily the best way to make wine, but it's certainly a way to understand what works and what doesn't across a variety of different conditions for those grapes. Now that I've got control of how these grapes are farmed or cropped, the actual say in the viticultural itself, I feel that I can now kind of tie those two pieces together and get the best possible product out of both sides of the operation. And it's such a luxury to have that.
So thinking about wine, we talk a lot about wine and food and the pairing, and I'm sure at the Italian restaurant there was a lot of that. How do you think about wine and food when you're thinking about making your wines?
Yeah, I make really acid-driven wines. If I'm being honest, I appreciate a good amount of freshness, and the only way you get that is farming or picking those grapes on a series of practices based around making that style of wine. I think wine should be had with food. Personally, that's kind of paradigm that I grew up in at the Italian restaurant. You look at most Italian wines, and they're not meant to be cocktailed. And I think that, on balance, a lot of like American producers here are creating wine in a style to be cocktailed and, kind of consumed on their own. I think that's maybe an antiquated view at this point domestically. And I think I do like the trend that's happened over the last like 10 or 15 years of acid driven lower alcohol wines that are meant to be consumed during a meal or at least, snacking. Rather than just consumed on their own.
Yeah, I actually agree with you 100% on a number of things, including wine should be consumed with food. I think sometimes people find like Italian wines or some European wines underwhelming because they really are meant to be had with food. Mm-hmm. And then I think about this cocktailing kind of concept. We talk about this concept of cocktailing because part of what I think is this hegemony of like California Cabernet is based on this concept of wine by itself, like cocktailing the wine rather than how is it going to pair with a food.
Right. Yeah. It's stylistically designed to be a standalone beverage, and try pairing a Manhattan or a martini with an entree. I guarantee it's not going to work. It's not something that wine should ever do and hasn't done historically. And I think that, that's something that predecessors got right in this industry, is that this is always intended to be something that you consumed alongside food. So why are we straying so far from that?
Yeah. And I do see that there's this trend. I think I'm seeing a lot in Oregon, this trend towards more about the food and wine connection. And then we'll get to in a little bit, we'll get to Sunday night dinner. So, the food and wine connection that we're going to talk about. But one other question for you, just related to Stoller wine. So Stoller has several, as we talked about, Stoller has several labels. So there's Stoller, there's Chehalem, there's Chemistry. How do you think about them differently? Or how differently do you think about them?
If we're talking Chehalem, I want to give a shout out to Katie Santora. She's the winemaker there and fantastic collaborator with our facility here. But she does great wines under her own purview at Chehalem for sure. The brands that I'm running here are the Chemistry brand and the Stoller Family Estate. For me, the Chemistry brand is more about a broad representation of what the state or even more recently the region can do. It's understanding the kind of the general trends of a vintage, and then locking in the best possible fruit for that vintage, and giving it an honest expression in the winery. For Stoller Family Estate, I don't know. I hate to throw too much love at like one project, but it's so nice to work on just one hillside in the Dundee Hills and get to focus on 240 acres of contiguously planted grapes. That is so sexy. It's so nice. Like it's understanding the nuances of different parts of the hillside, but then still kind of understanding a broader character of what this site can do. I never had that luxury at previous gigs, and to be able to work with the fruit in that context here has just been just a real blessing, if I'm being honest. I think that stylistically, I can still pay homage to the previous winemakers that have been here, and kind of respect the talent there, but then at the same time, have my own creative purchase in what this site can be.
And that probably has some, you had talked about how you're starting to spend more time with the grapes versus the juice. So is that part of it too, that you have this hillside that you can really focus on?
Oh yeah, I can walk out of my office and be at the furthest block in about 15 minutes. It's how I spend my lunch hours, or I don't know, half a morning on an RTV or something like that, just checking out grapes. It's so immediate. It's just part of my work life here. It's incredible, and yeah, I couldn't be more thankful. I feel more blessed to kind of be part of that.
I was going to say, like, a lot of jealousy. It's pretty cool that you're able to do that. That's a pretty wonderful way to make a living.
It's not lost on me, man. Yeah, I love it.
So anything that you've like kind of learned about yourself, anything interesting or important that you've kind of come to the realization of in your time as a winemaker?
Yeah, I think that This is probably a common story for winemakers of my generation, but and I think you ask any of them, now through the next 20, 30 years, and they'll probably tell you something, similar. It's that they understand how to adapt. I think we're living in a world with a changing climate, and with that comes unpredictability that our predecessors never saw. I think that in terms of just testing your metal or your skill in these vintages, it's not getting easier and it's not getting consistent. But the thing that you can bank on is that it's always going to be different. And I think that because of that, we're all kind of showing ourselves that we're capable of being adaptive to these changes. I don't know. I've just always been really proud of my teams and people that support us in the winery about that kind of adaptivity. And I think that if you're going to have a successful wine brand in America, you need to excel at exactly that skill.
So you bring up a really interesting point with all of the changes in climate. And we've also had, for those people who don't know, we've had many summers with smoke, et cetera. How do you think about the impact of a changing climate? As a winemaker for a specific winery or brand, there's a taste, there's a style of wine that you're going after, but you also have to adapt, as you said, to the changes in the climate, which changes the fruit, et cetera. How do you think about that? How do you plan for that?
Well, yeah, it's both preparation and reaction, right? I think it's not just looking at a year and a March and saying like, well, I'm sure we can hit these style points. We'll try to hit these style points if the weather cooperates. We know we're going to get the farming right. We know we're going to get everything done in the winery that we possibly can, but in the end, you have to fight for the capability to have a number of different contingencies in place, and the preparation for those contingencies, kind of under your roof before you actually start getting grapes in the barn. I think that, in a broad sense, it's not that like these vintages are just going to be hotter. There'll be different types of hot. For instance, last year, we had a very late bloom. It was cold well into the spring, into May and later. We ended up harvesting nearly a month later than the last decade's average worth of harvests. So that was something we hadn't seen in a long time, and had to basically react to the conditions that way through a number of different means, which took into account the frost event that happened in April that year, and then also done in the context of kind of a flagging labor market up here for seasonal workers, both vineyard side and on the winery. So you just have to be resourceful in the end. I mean, it's making sure that you know which connections that you need to foster in terms of getting the dry goods and the labor in the winery to make these things happen. What specifically you need to plan for these extreme events. And then making the case to the people that cut the checks to make sure that they understand that if you're going to make good wine this year, you need to be ready for all of these things.
So I'm curious, you're making me think. I'm assuming it's pretty similar where you are, because the weather patterns are fairly similar on this side of the Cascades, even down further south in Oregon from where we are. But this summer to me has been very unusual. I'm a lifelong Seattleite. And, usually we say in Seattle that summer doesn't start until July 5th. Right. But this summer has been really unusual. Like since May, it's been warm and not a ton of rain. It's been beautiful. I tell people who have been visiting, like, this is not the way it usually is. Later summer is usually beautiful, but not the whole summer. So how are you thinking about, I know you've got a few months left and anything can happen, but how are you thinking about this year's crop?
We saw the shortest interval between bud break and bloom that we've seen in probably about 15 to 20 years. That's startling, especially kind of knowing how late vines were pushed into the season last year. I'm seeing a ton of variability in terms of berry morphology, the shape of the berries themselves, and then the cluster size, and also just generally fruit set, or the amount of fruit we have per acre out in the field. To answer your question, we've got to solve for everything this year. So it's both getting crop levels correct. It's making sure that we have sufficient labor, supplied to actually pick it, and then I think making sure that late season irrigations and sprays happen as they should. I don't think that the disease pressure this year is nearly as bad as it was in 2022. The spore counts and the weather aren't setting up to be the potential disaster that 2022 could have been. But at the same time, it's Oregon. You just never know. you know.
Interesting. Yeah, I just wonder, and I'm ignorant about it, but I mean, would this be the type of weather where maybe you have to harvest a little earlier this year?
Yeah, we're looking right now at bringing some of the first fruit in probably the first week of September, maybe into the second week of September, kind of depending on how weather holds up for the rest of the month. It's looking like there's some days on the calendar that may be over 100. And any weather over 95, the vines basically shut down, and that 100 to 110 day interval from bloom to when you should harvest kind of gets extended when the vines can't execute most of their metabolism during those heat spells.
And that the September date is unusual. Is that right?
That's been more normal than what we've passed. Yeah, I think, gosh, in 2014 we're doing picks in August.
Oh, wow.
But September's over the last decade become what I've known to be pretty normal. When I first moved up here in 2009, it was much more common to be the last week of September, first week of October.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes you could push picks well into November in some cases if the rains didn't set up. But this year, just talking to the meteorologists here locally, I think that we're probably going to start seeing rains maybe late September. The first week of October. So I think everybody's going to have everything in the barn by that second week of October.
Makes sense. So you talked about, just going back, you talked about this Barolo that you had that haunted you. Have you ever made a wine that you felt was haunting?
Great question. Oh, let's see. Yes, it was weirdly enough, the 2020 Dundee Hills Pinot Noir off of our estate here at Stoller. And it was during the smoke event that we harvested a lot of these grapes, but we got them off the vine in quick enough fashion to where I could actually make something decent out of it. And it was my first year here at Stoller. It was a year of validation for me, where not only had all the lessons that I learned at ERAF been tested and kind of validated in my cellar, but then also having to respond to one of the biggest ecological catastrophes of my career in winemaking. It made a beautiful wine, just silky tannin, great resolution in terms of fruit. There was a complexity to it that I've rarely been able to repeat. And I think it's going to hang out for a while too. 2020, unfortunately, was setting up to be a classic vintage here in Oregon. And I think a lot of those red wines, if they weren't tainted by smoke, were going to be something that people would have been talking about for decades.
Well, this is a perfect segue into our next question, which is we talk about Sunday night dinner. My wife and I, Italian-American families, Sunday night dinner is a big deal. So Karl, you're invited. You're invited, and you're not far away. Like, we've offered this to other people, but there are somebody in New Zealand or somebody in Portugal. Like, you don't have an excuse. We're gonna either come down or you're gonna come up, and we're gonna have a Sunday night dinner. Okay. And we're gonna serve, pretty standard Italian foods most of the time. So, along with this 2020 vintage Stoller Pinot Noir, which I'm expecting you to bring, what wines would you bring that you've made, and why?
Oh, I got that easy. Honestly, I love showing people our most recent vintage of our Stoller Family Estate Rosé. It's reliably one of the more acidic rosés that you'll drink, but because of that, the freshness, the vibrancy, I don't know, it's fun in a glass. It's one of the first wines you want to drink at a dinner party that's going to be fun and full of conversation. I think that it's something that the wine itself is an icebreaker, and you get to just kind of turn your mind off and be yourself and enjoy this wine with a giant smile on your face when you start drinking. I think the perfect wine to have as a aperitif at a dinner like that. Next would be our estate Chardonnay. I think that's a better conversation piece probably than the rosé. Not necessarily a conversation starter, but there's a little bit more brooding character to this wine. I think it's something that you would end up talking a little bit about more in terms of the minerality, the length and everything like that. I'd hope that with a fish dish or potentially a salad, this thing would really sing. And then you're right, that 2020
woohoo
Dundee Hills Pinot Noir. Kind of like to cap the dinner off with something like that, something that honestly speaks for itself. A little bit more contemplative, a little bit more serious, something with some depth to it for sure.
Okay, you're on. It's recorded. This is all recorded, so it's
I'm coming over.
It's all happening, and these are the wines you're bringing. I love it. Wow, I'm serious. You're invited, and when we go down to Stoller, we're going to come visit you too. And
all right, I'm going to pick up on that.
Yeah, do a little tasting. I like it. Okay, so we're just about done here, but before we go, I want to make sure that people can find you, can find Stoller Wines, and then I understand that there's something big coming up for Stoller.
That's right. Yeah. So we're coming up on our 30th anniversary for Bill Stoller, our owner, purchasing the estate here. Bill Stoller actually, his family actually had this estate for the better part of, I think, 80 years. It was founded in 1943. So after he had a career in a number of different industries, including express personnel, he bought this property again in 1993. And planting grapes a couple years later. It's a big milestone just in what the brand is, just jumping into the wine industry and kind of becoming one of that first or second wave of wine growers in the state of Oregon. Yeah, so just to quote Bill here, he says, "I'm thankful to my family who left their families to find the land and start a turkey farm. They didn't know it at the time, but it was meant to be a vineyard." So, over the next several months, we'll be kind of celebrating that anniversary out here at the turkey farm.
That's awesome. That's amazing. And then Stoller, we can find Stoller at the website www.stollerfamilyestate.com, and then Facebook and Instagram is at Stoller Wine. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. If y'all are interested in visiting, you've got all the directions out there to set up some reservations, or just pop in if you want to, or just get some wine shipped to you as well. But again, we'd love to have anybody that is interested out to the estate itself.
Yeah, and it's I'm looking at a map. It's not far from where we are, so it's kind of near McMinnville, between Portland and McMinnville. Is that right?
That's right. So you don't have an excuse not to come down here and visit.
We really don't. So we're going to be there. We might be there tomorrow, Karl. You don't know. Well, thank you very much. This has been awesome. Really great to talk to you, to have kind of more in-depth conversations about the art and science of wine. So just been such a pleasure to talk to you, Karl.
Likewise, Joe. Yeah. Thanks for reaching out, and thanks for having me on your podcast.
You bet. And I do have to say, I have tasted your wares, and they are excellent. Really been impressed with the wines that you create. Now I know the creator of the wine, so it just kind of makes it a little bit more special. But I've really enjoyed the wines that I've had from Stoller.
I appreciate hearing that. Thank you.
You bet. All right. We want to thank you very much for listening to our interview with Karl Weichold from Stoller Family Wines. What a great interview, and just a great person. Really had a great time talking to Karl, both in the interview and after the interview. And just in case you were worried that you had to memorize all this information, don't worry. You can find out all this information on our website, thewinepairpodcast.com, in our show notes. So if you go to our website and you find this episode, click on the episode and then scroll down and you'll see our show notes, and you can find information on Karl and Stoller Family Winery there. On Facebook, you can also find them at Stoller Wine, and on Instagram at Stoller Wine. That's STOLLERWINE. And their website is www.stollerfamilyestate.com. And there you can find out more about how to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Stoller Family Wines, which we hope you do. And we also hope you'll subscribe to our podcast, The Wine Pair Podcast, and follow us on Instagram or Threads. And you can also sign up for our newsletter if you head to our website, thewinepairpodcast.com. And you can reach out to us and get more information about Stoller Wines at joe@thewinepairpodcast.com. And if you're enjoying what you're listening to, we would love it if you could leave us a nice rating and review as a free way to support us. And so with that, we're going to sign off. We look forward to hearing from you soon. And as we like to say, life is short, so stop drinking shitty wine. Bye-bye.
And the happy ending.